Baylen Linnekin has joined us here today. He is a lawyer, he's a scholar, he's an adjunct professor at George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School. He's actually a food lawyer, and to be honest with you, I didn't even realize that that was such a specialty, but evidently it is. He's a frequent lecturer. As I said, he does teach at the law school as well, and what he teaches there is food law and policy. He also serves on the board of the Academy of Food Law and Policy. And if you are a reader of scholarly publications, you will have seen his work in many of those. If you watch network television, you will also have seen him on a number of the cable network shows because he is considered an expert in this area. And to that end, he has written this book called Biting the Hands That Feed Us: How Fewer, Smarter Laws Would Make Our Food System More Sustainable. And at the end of his presentation today, if you would like to purchase this book, we do have copies outside in the lobby, $15 for the book, and he has graciously agreed to stay and sign copies and talk with anyone who'd like to purchase that book after the presentation. So today, Baylen is going to be talking with us about some of the themes that are in his new book. And he's focusing on telling the human stories about the farmers, the food producers, these folks who actually have been hurt by bad food laws that promote unsustainable food practices, when the point, as we are all told, is that we would like to have policies that promote sustainable practices. With that, I give you Baylen Linnekin.
Thank you very much, Donna. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, and I want to thank Corey and the John Locke Foundation very much for having me down here. It's an honor and a pleasure to get to speak with you all. I see some familiar faces and some other ones I look forward to talking with during the Q&A and during the book signing, hopefully, too. So this book, as the introduction noted, the argument that I make in the book is that there are federal, state, and local rules that either promote unsustainable food practices or that restrict people from engaging in sustainable food practices. So what does sustainability mean in the food system? Basically, I define it as rules that, the outcomes basically are ones that minimize the negative impact of the food system, that maximize the benefits of the food system, and then also make sure that the people involved in the food system, farmers and others, can sustain themselves rather than looking for outside support. So with that sort of basic groundwork laid down, I'd like to talk about why I wrote this book. I think the general belief amongst many people who support a more sustainable food system is that this is something that requires more and more regulations. And there are people who are opposed to sustainability because they think that it requires more and more regulations. And I'd like to build a bridge. You were all watching the debate last night. I'm sorry.
No power.
Yeah. But I'd like to build a bridge between people who perhaps might not agree on many issues, but who can agree that we can actually have a more sustainable food system in many cases with fewer rules. And so I'm appealing to people on the left and the right to work together and to promote sustainability. The book is divided up into 4 main substantive chapters. The first one talks about food safety rules. The second one talks about big food and big government working together. The third talks about food waste. And then the last one, which I'm very proud of the title of the chapter, which is I Say Tomato, You Say No, talks about people who want to engage in sustainable food practices at home or in their communities and are told by the government that they can't. So right now I'm going to read briefly from the introduction of the book, just to sort of give you a sense of my writing style and of the basic premises of the book, and then I'll go through and discuss some of those human stories that Donna mentioned from each of the main substantive chapters. All right. This is, well, I'll go in, but a chef I've known for several years who I've never actually met in person, Mark Denitis, in Colorado, who I think is a beacon of sustainability, or at least was until what I'm about to tell you happened. Chef Mark Denitis was a rising star in the Denver food community in early 2012. His artisanal salumeria, Il Mondo Vecchio, was still relatively new to the scene, but was already one of the hottest and most respected food businesses in the state. With a partner, Dinitis had founded Il Mondo Vecchio as a tribute to the principles, traditions, and recipes he learned while growing up as a first-generation Italian-American. The homage was explicit. Il Mondo Vecchio translates to, for those of you who are lack basic Italian skills, which actually includes me too, translates to the old world. As a traditional salumeria, Il Mondo Vecchio produced and sold a rich variety of Italian sausages and aged meats. Its products contained no artificial ingredients. In fact, the ingredient list was short on words, and I interviewed Dinitis back in 2012 when Il Mondo Vecchio was open, and he told me the ingredients were sea salt, meat, quality spices, and thyme, T-I-M-E. These included things like salami and pepperoni, things that you're probably familiar with. Those hands worked magic. Denver Post profile of Il Mondo Vecchio raved that its products had helped make Denver, quote, a special place for old world meats. He won awards from the Colorado Restaurant Association and from Eater, the popular food website. He was a finalist, actually, for Eater's hottest chef in Denver. And Bravo, the television network that's home to Top Chef, called him the Sausage King. But it wasn't just its artisanal methods that set Il Mondo Vecchio apart. The company also sourced the ingredients that went into its products with the utmost care. Its salt came from an ancient seabed in nearby Utah. It sourced heritage pork from Boulder's Cure Organic Farm, a family business that also raises over 100 types of certified organic vegetables. Cure Farm markets its produce only within 50 miles of the farm and uses what it calls biodynamic methods to maintain and encourage natural diversity. It was difficult not to be impressed by Il Mondo Vecchio. I wrote in 2012, quote, I think it would be hard to find a better example of a traditional, conscientious, sustainable, and local producer than Il Mondo Vecchio. They expanded their facilities, and Dinitis' partner launched a retail store to expand the business further. But by Thanksgiving 2012, Dinitis was out of a job, forced to close Il Mondo Vecchio. What had changed so quickly? Had demand plummeted? Had everyone in Denver suddenly become vegetarian? No. So what had happened? Dinitis, as all producers do who were selling meat products, had had his products inspected by the USDA. These inspectors have to be on site. They tested. There was never any pathogens found in his food. His food was always safe and for sale and consumption. He had other certifications. He was doing everything right, and he passed all the tests with flying colors. Unfortunately, though, the USDA inspector came to him one day and said, hey, you're not adding nitrates or nitrites to your food. And nitrates, for those of you who don't know, are naturally occurring substances. They're found in celery root and other green leafy vegetables. There's nothing wrong with nitrates or nitrites per se, but they were not common in the old world, and Mark Dinitis was using old world methods and trying to meet demand and also follow new world regulations. That's what his website said, in fact. But the USDA inspector said, you have to add nitrates and nitrites or you can't sell your products. And he asked why, and they said, there are some benefits to nitrates and nitrites. They do reduce the potential for pathogens, but Dinitis had produced food that contained no pathogens without using these, and so he should be free to do so. So Dinitis asked, what can I do? How can I continue to operate? And they said, the only thing you can do is either add nitrates or nitrites or pay for a challenge study. Basically, stop selling your food, pay for a lot of science, and then try to prove to us that your methods are safe. The sale of his safe products apparently hadn't done that. So Dinitis, who's a very, very principled person, decided that rather than lie to his customers, as he puts it, he would just go out of business. He wasn't going to add nitrates or nitrates. And so that's what happened. He's been doing other things since 2012 while trying to revive the business, but there's really no path forward for him at this point. If this book were the story of Mark Dinitis, it would be a very, very short book, but it's not, because this is actually a very, very, very common type of situation that food producers, particularly smaller sustainable ones, find themselves in. And I'll read one passage, a short one. It turns out that the USDA salumi regulations that Dinitis was subject to are but one small set of rules in a sea of red tape that makes growing, raising, buying, selling, and marketing a panoply of sustainably produced foods anywhere from difficult to impossible, regulations like those that closed Il Mondo Vecchio aren't the exception, they're the rule, quite literally. And if the USDA is not unique, other federal agencies, including the FDA as well as state and local agencies, have their own sets of rules that result in fewer and fewer sustainable food choices being available. So I'm done with the reading portion of the presentation. I'm going to go into some food safety examples, those that I discuss in Chapter 1. And if I don't get to something, I encourage you to ask me about it. I lead off with a discussion of the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, known as FSMA. I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A, but I'm going to go into some other examples. There also are farmers market rules in Massachusetts, which I discuss, and Mississippi, which essentially make it difficult or impossible for farmers to sell their food at farmers markets, which again have the word farmers in the name. But what I'm going to talk about now is an FDA cheese crackdown. How many people here like cheese? All right. Blue cheese is fantastic. Absolutely. I had some in my salad for dinner last night. All right, we all like cheese. And artisanal cheesemakers tend to age their cheese to ripen it on wooden boards. And these wooden boards have been used essentially since cheese was first made. And there's some benefits to ripening on wooden boards. They help absorb liquid, and they help create that sort of hard casing that you see on brie and things like that. So it was 2014, the FDA showed up, inspectors at a cheese maker in New York State, and they found listeria on the cheese and on the wooden boards. And because I'm not a food anarchist, and I'll go into later in the book some good food rules, this is the sort of thing the FDA should be doing. They should be inspecting. They should be making sure that people aren't producing food that actually poisons us or kills us. And so this was good. The FDA found this problem. They ordered the producer to stop sale on that cheese. And if that were the end of the story, again, there'd be not much to report. But what the FDA did instead is say, not only can you not continue to sell your products, but in fact, we've never permitted the ripening of cheese on wooden boards anywhere, and we're not going to start doing that now. And this was news to the American Cheese Society, which represents 1,000 cheesemakers around the country who ripen their cheese on wooden boards. This was problematic for producers of all sizes, but particularly smaller and sustainable ones. I give two examples of cheese producers who said that it would cost them $20 million to swap out their wooden boards and buy something like stainless steel. This was going to put out of business pretty much every small cheese producer in this country. So there was an outrage. Representative Peter Welch, who's a Democrat from Virginia, took to Twitter and had all these, I think, appropriately angry is probably to minimize his expressions, but these angry tweets. The FDA was talking about essentially putting many of his constituents and many cheesemakers around the country out of business. The FDA eventually relented, sort of, because the FDA often, as I detail in the book, oversteps its bounds and then backtracks. What they said is that they're not taking any action, that this one inspector's letter was perhaps a little bit too over the top. But the FDA did say, hey, we're actually going to ask you, cheesemakers of America, to essentially prove to us, through data and whatnot, that ripening cheese on wooden boards, which again has been going on for thousands of years, is safe. And so there's a bit of a holding pattern at this point. So which again can stifle innovation. It can prevent people from investing in cheese making if you feel like you're going to be regulated to death a year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. So that's one example of food safety regulations that aren't really making us safer. I should also note that cheese has natural antimicrobial properties. I'm sorry, cheese actually does, but I meant to say wooden boards have natural antimicrobial properties. And scientists I cite in the book have shown that, in fact, ripening cheese on wooden boards is safer than doing so on stainless steel. Moving on to a discussion of the ways that big food and big government work together. Big food is a term that's popular with many on the left. Big government is a term that's popular with many on the right. And yet it turns out that they oftentimes are working together. I discuss farm subsidies in this chapter, which I think are uniformly wrong and should all be axed yesterday. I'm happy to answer questions about that. I also talk about state ag-gag laws. How many people here have heard of ag-gag laws? Almost a third, half. North Carolina is one state that has such a law. They are also uniformly unconstitutional and awful protections for one segment of the animal agriculture industry. Happy to talk about that later, but because I'm trying to go with the personal stories here, I'm going to talk about the case of O'Cheesy Creamery in Florida's Panhandle. Who's familiar with this story? Okay, good. So you probably shouldn't be, because they only have 3 employees. They only sell their milk within like a 15-mile radius of their creamery. But they're a great example of a sustainable creamery. They raise smaller, I think it's Jersey cows, which require less water. In Florida's Panhandle, it's hot. That's a good way to minimize your water use, and also raise cows that are simply easier to manage. They compost all their manure. They use recyclable glass bottles. I mean, they're a model of sustainability. They have salt licks on the farm. They feed their cattle fermented hay that they raise right there on the farm. They're a great example of, I think, what small farmer, small creamery can and should be doing. So they sell cream, whole milk, and for a time were selling skim milk. They also were inspected by the Florida Agriculture Department, and there were never any food safety issues. They pasteurized their milk. This isn't a raw milk case. And so they were selling their skim milk, and this was for a couple of years. And one day an inspector showed up and said, "You don't add vitamin A to your skim milk." And they said, "Yeah, we know. We don't add anything to our skim milk." And the inspector said, "Well, actually, you can't call this skim milk unless you add vitamin A to your skim milk." And they seemed puzzled. And they said, "Well, why not?" So Florida, just actually like the FDA at the federal level, has a standard of identity. This is essentially a definition, which, as I'll describe, doesn't necessarily comport with the dictionary definition of a term. And Florida's definition, standard of identity for skim milk, is that skim milk is skim milk with vitamin A added. When you remove the cream from milk, essentially the vitamins reside in the cream, and so that one vitamin leaves. This was, and I write in the book, it may have made sense 75 years ago when people sometimes had vitamin A deficiencies, but it's not the case now, and frankly there's a danger actually in having too much vitamin A, but most people are getting it from their diets. So again, not a vitamin A problem, but so the inspector said essentially, "You can't sell this unless you add vitamin A," and they said, "Well, we're not going to add vitamin A. What do we do?" And the state said very helpfully, "Well, you can call it something else." And they said, "Okay, well, what do you want us to call it?" And I swear I'm not making this up. Non-grade A milk product, natural milk vitamins removed. And they couldn't mention skim milk anywhere on the package. They couldn't mention the fact that it contained no fat, which is one of the reasons people actually buy this non-grade A milk product, natural milk vitamins removed. This is their sort of bizarre solution. So they went to federal court, actually, eventually. The Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian nonprofit law firm in the D.C. area, represented them in a First Amendment case, basically saying, we're referring to this skim milk as skim milk. Honestly, we should be allowed to, the First Amendment protects our right to call something what it is. And during the course of the litigation, I served as an expert in support of the creamery. I talked about how people who buy food from local food are educated consumers, that no one would be misled, that the creamery had offered to say skim milk, no vitamin A added, and that wasn't good enough for the state. So in the course of the litigation, the state did change their tune a little bit. They said, "You know what, you don't have to call it non-grade A milk product, natural milk vitamins removed. You can call it imitation skim milk." And yeah, so the chuckling, I think, that probably explains everything. You would think that this story would have a happy ending because it's so absurd, but in fact, and this is one of the largest dairy lobbies in the country, actually, came, sort of swooped in to help, but not the creamery. It supported the state in saying, no, we need to have this mandatory vitamin A addition. And a judge ruled that Florida's regulations were perfectly reasonable, and that case is now being appealed. So, I mean, the large dairy lobby swooping in, I think, is a great example of how big government and big food are working together. That happened within the last month or two, so after the book was had gone to press. But I think this is just a remarkable story of how this one small creamery really represents everything that's wrong with rules that favor big producers over smaller ones, and it's the industry and government working together. Who here in the last, shifting gears to the next chapter on food waste, who here has read a story in the last, let's say, month that referenced food waste somewhere in a newspaper? So, quarter to a third of you. It's definitely a more important and more recognizable topic these days than it was 1, 5, 10 years ago. People increasingly care about food waste, and there are good reasons. We waste 40% of our food. Is there anyone here who's not going to finish their lunch? Because we're going to have a conversation. Yeah. All right. So we waste most of our food, or a large percentage of our food, but a lot of it is wasted in the fields and elsewhere. So it gets wasted before it even makes it to the eater of the home. I do talk about a couple programs that do waste food on a massive scale, and I'm happy to answer questions about those. One is the National School Lunch Program. The First Lady proposed rules that reformed that program a couple years ago, and there's been sort of what I think is a bit of a shrill debate between some members of Congress and others and the First Lady over sort of, did this create food waste and whatnot. So it's important, and I note this in the book, Michelle Obama did not create the problem of food waste in the school lunch program. I remember as a kid, recall throwing some food away, and it's just gotten worse of late. But I can save that for the Q&A. There also are fisheries rules. I discuss a case in North Carolina where some fishermen who caught some, I think it was striped bass, and who've actually are now, I think, before a federal judge because they caught it in the wrong place at the wrong time. Essentially rules that encourage people to, if they catch the wrong fish in the wrong place at the wrong time, to throw that fish away rather than bringing it back to shore to feed people. But the example I want to talk about here is USDA grading of produce and of meat. How many people here, and I spoke at Politics and Prose bookstore in D.C. Sorry, my days are running together on Saturday. And I brought in some carrots, some from my local farmer's market, and then a 1-pound bag from the grocery store. You all buy the sort of plastic 1-pound bag, or 1, 2, or 5-pound bag. Have you ever noticed that it says number 1 on the bag of carrots? And there's also EU number 1. So these are regulations essentially established in partnership between the USDA and the food industry, and they say that carrots, in this case, and from apples to watermelons, there are 150 different rules around the grading of produce. For the carrots, they say that a carrot must be at least 3/4 an inch circumference to be considered a grade A carrot, and it must have color that is typical of the variety. So the same color orange of all the carrots you see. The rules don't say that it has to be flavorless, but that's usually the case. How many people here buy carrots at the farmer's market? Yeah, it's like 25%. Sometimes they look sort of like a hand, or they have little sort of odd irregular things coming off the side. And these carrots are not carrots that would be considered gradable by the USDA. So this is a problem because people who work in the fields picking carrots know that in order to be reimbursed for their work, they can either pick the carrots that are going to, quote, make the grade, or they can just leave them there because they're not going to get reimbursed for them. So these rules promote waste. And you've seen other examples. There are USDA Prime, USDA Choice, and I think select cuts of meat at the grocery store. apples have to have a particular percentage of red coverage in order to get the, I think it's fancy designation. None of these rules have anything to do with flavor, with quality. They really just are about enforcing uniformity in the grocery store. And here's where I can blame some of us as well, me included. We're part of the problem. It's not just that the rules exist to essentially create food waste. We've come to expect that all of our carrots will look uniform, that all of our apples will have a nice amount of red on them. And so essentially grocery stores respond to that by asking for 1, 2, and 5 pound bags of carrots. Farmers respond to that signal by essentially only shipping those things. But at the end of this chain is the USDA rules that are promoting this. Nothing prohibits people, and again, at the farmer's market, it's not illegal to buy a carrot that looks like a hand. But those sorts of carrots don't actually make it into the grocery stores, even though, as a general rule, they're more tasty. And so that's where I can go into my sort of personal description. I went to Portugal, to Lisbon, a couple of summers ago, and I was fortunate before I went to read a New York Times article on a group called Fruta Ephaea, which means ugly fruit. And I got in touch with a woman from the group, and they're based in Lisbon, and I met with her. They're essentially trying to combat this sort of food waste. The way they're doing it is, and again, these rules exist similarly in the EU, although the EU is dramatically scaled back. I think they only have maybe 8 food standards of identity at this point, grades rather, which, again, the USDA has 150 here. So what they're doing, Fruta Ephaea in Portugal, is they're working with farmers, and they're asking them to pick up the foods that that is not grade worthy. They then buy that for 50% less than the farmer would have gotten it at the market, and they use the equivalent of a CSA. You're familiar with the CSA? It's Community Supported Agriculture. Essentially a box that's, here's what we have for the week. And then they sell that for 50% less than consumers would have paid for otherwise. I think you spend $8 to join the CSA and then $7 a week. So it's very inexpensive in a place like Portugal where the economic downturn is hit hard. People can't afford produce necessarily. It's a great way to make sure that farmers are getting more for their dollar, and also that consumers are able to afford to eat fruits and vegetables. I was very lucky that Maria, the woman I met, brought a melon and some grapes. The melons were tiny, they'd never make it into the grocery store. The grapes were irregularly sized, same thing. The best food maybe not the best food, the best fruit I had in Europe by far. The flavor of these sort of smaller and ugly fruits is often superior to that of the stuff you get at the grocery store. So my plea to you is to buy ugly fruits and vegetables, but also to expect, talk to your grocer, talk to your farmer, talk to your lawmaker, and ask them to make some meaningful changes with these grading rules. So on to the last of the substantive chapters. This, frankly, is the one that, and I'm sure I look outraged. I'm very emotional. But this is the chapter that angers me the most, the rules in this chapter. They're ones that say you can't do things at home, you can't obtain or share your own food. I give an example of a guy who, his mom actually came to my book talk on Saturday. He was surrounded by 3 bike cops in a park in Maryland for the crime of, I think it was a misdemeanor, of having picked some blackberries in a public park. There are absurd rules around foraging around this country in many parks, and so he was fined $50 for destroying park property for literally having picked a few blackberries. Interestingly, I had picked blackberries the day before in a neighboring park. Luckily, was not harassed by the police there. So that's one sort of rule that I talk about here. Another one is gardening. How many people have a garden in their yard? Okay, I have on my balcony, I grow some tomatoes, and I have some basil that bolted months ago, but that I'm still picking from. Anyone here have a garden in their front yard? Okay, 2, 3, all right, sort of, 2.5 people. So in many places, and perhaps even where you live, that's illegal. In in this country. And I discuss a few different cases involving this. A woman in Tulsa, Oklahoma was unemployed. She was raising food in her front yard because that's where she got sun. She was raising stevia and chives, and she had some fruit trees growing and whatnot. And the city came and ordered her to remove them. She said no. They came back when she wasn't home and removed them for her. They chopped down her trees and they pulled out her fruits and vegetables. She sued and lost, which is just mind-blowing. I think the judge said that she was given notice and therefore her rights essentially were extinguished. There's a case, actually, the Institute for Justice, again, in South Florida, is representing a couple who had been growing fruits and vegetables in their front yard for years. Unfortunately, the city changed their law and said that you can't grow vegetables. Fruits are fine. And ordered them to remove these or face a $1,000 fine. There are other people. One woman in Michigan was threatened with arrest if she didn't remove her garden from her front yard. These are largely down to zoning rules. The Florida case, recently the couple lost their lawsuit against the city, and the judge said that he or she, I can't remember what the judge's gender, but the judge could imagine a situation in which a city wouldn't want a garden in someone's front yard for aesthetic reasons, and that was good enough. I feel like, well, anyways, I would like to throw some fruit at the judge. So that's terrible, and rules like that should never exist, particularly ones that pertain to growing food on our property. But an even worse set of rules is one that exists in many cities around the country that prohibit people from sharing food with the homeless and less fortunate. This is by far, if I could sort of wave a magic wand and extinguish one law on the books, this is one that I would choose to do first. These laws, they're not necessarily in tiny cities. The ACLU has sued Philadelphia and Las Vegas and gotten them to pull back their bans on sharing food with the homeless and less fortunate. But people in Orlando have been arrested for doing this. San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, I don't know what the thing is in Texas, but those cities currently prohibit people from sharing food with the homeless and less fortunate. And how many people in here are a Michael Bloomberg fan? One? Okay, all right. Maybe 1.5. When Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, he told people that they couldn't donate food to city shelters because the city could not assess the salt, fat, or nutrition content of the food, as if these are the chief concerns of people who can't get enough to eat. These laws are uniformly awful and need to be wiped from the books immediately, and I think that we need to scream at the people who support them until they do so. I take a sort of more civil track with the other laws in the book, but this one particularly raises my ire. So those are some of the bad food rules that I discuss in the book. Again, I did note earlier that I'm not a food anarchist, so I suppose I should. The very, very thin chapter on there are good food rules. There are a couple. One is food safety rules, which I alluded to before, that actually require food to be safe. That require inspections, that require people to demonstrate that their food does not contain pathogens. These are good rules, whether they're at the local or the state or the federal level, and I think that we should encourage them. That's the original mission of the FDA and the USDA and local health departments going back more than 100 years. The idea that you're not adulterating or misbranding your food. I support that. There's a federal ban on shark finning that I support. How many people here have had shark fin soup? 2, 3. All right. It's like a once in a lifetime kind of thing. It's not terribly good. But no? All right. It's personal opinion. So there's a federal ban that says that essentially the process of shark finning is a cruel one that anyone who, and I'm not a hunter, but anyone who, say, hunts deer in the woods would chafe at. If you hunt a deer in the woods, you shoot it, you can gut it in the woods, but you have to take out the carcass. You don't just cut the head off the buck and leave the rest in the woods, because that promotes waste and sort of overkilling. But what happens with sharks, or has happened in our waters until a couple of years ago, is that the practice of finning, which involves cutting the fin off the shark and then essentially leaving the rest of the carcass to float in the water, has resulted in tremendous overfishing of an endangered and important species. So the federal law doesn't ban shark fin soup, doesn't ban eating sharks, but it does say if you catch a shark, you have to take the whole thing back. And considering that a fin is something like 5% of the total weight or volume of the shark, you're having boats that are now filled up with sharks rather than fins, and that's saving sharks while still being able to meet some demand for shark fin soup, which is a delicacy. So these are the sorts of rules that I do support. Is there any sort of guiding principle around these rules? I think there is. I think that when rules can promote sustainable food practices or protect people's right to engage in them without sort of lessening food safety or other important societal needs we have in place, then the rules should always bend towards sustainability. And I think that not only we need to look at, essentially take a microscope to all of the rules that we have on our books that pertain to food and make sure that they're encouraging or at least permitting sustainable food practices. But also I think going forward, we need to legislate with sustainability in mind. It's not something that necessarily requires, and I certainly have a litany of examples in the book, it's not something that requires this whole new regulatory structure. It's something that actually requires us to remove many of the bad rules that are on the books. And I think that that's how we should work moving forward, and I think that that will make our food system more sustainable, and I think will present us with some great food choices as well. So that's it, and I'm happy to take your questions.
You use the word sustainability a lot, but you haven't defined it, and I've heard of all kinds of definitions of the word, so what do you mean by, and what kind of rigorous test is there to decide whether an action at the margin is sustainable or not?
Okay, I think I did, but I'm happy to revisit. It is a practice that involves maximizing the benefits of the food system, minimizing its negative outcomes, environmental and otherwise, and making sure that those engaged in the food system, farmers and others, can sustain themselves rather than relying on support from outside. Okay. Did you?
For regulatory purposes, do you view those as empirically testable and in a rigorous way to guide the regulations that you think should be in place?
I think so. I mean, I think that you can devise tests that, in the same way you have people weighing decision making on both sides. So, for example, going back to the introduction of the book and Mark Denitis, who was producing food that was raised sustainably, and was essentially handcuffed by food safety rules. Those food safety rules didn't make food safer because Denitis tested and tested and tested, and his outcomes were always good. And so rather than mandating a particular process, I say that we demand good outcomes on the issue of food safety. And so that certainly is testable, that we, does your food contain listeria or does it not? And when it doesn't, then I think that regardless of whether you're chilling food in an ice chest or in a mechanized truck, as long as you're keeping your food at below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you're ensuring food safety, then that's an inspectable and testable thing. Yes?
In the example where the inspector said that they never allowed cheese to be fermented on the wood,
Mm-hmm.
was that in fact a regulation, or was that just something that the inspector came up with?
That's just something that the inspector came up with, and you'll see in many instances a lot of these problems arise when an inspector is sort of interpreting the rules how they want to, or how they've been told, or maybe they've changed their mind, or in many cases the inspector changes. You have this new inspector come in and suddenly things are different. That's, I think, the case with O'Cheesy and sort of the inspector who said, your milk is fine, and then the other one who came in and said, oh, by the way, you need to add vitamin A. So this was not in the case of cheese. There was no rule in the books that said you can or you can't ripen your cheese on wooden boards. Thanks. Yes.
I couldn't help but wonder about this garden in the front yard. Think these people have backyards? That's what people usually have their gardens in the backyards, close to people's kitchen.
No, that's a good point. So some people don't have backyards, or their backyard is shaded. And so, I mean, I live in a condo. I grow tomatoes and, as I said, basil and things like that on the balcony. But where I lived the last 2 or 3 years before that, our balcony didn't have sun. So try as I might, I couldn't grow anything. And I think people oftentimes face this, that their garden shaded or their backyard shaded, and so they're often out of luck if they want to garden there.
Is there any other justification to outline front yard gardens other than aesthetic?
No. It's
Kind of like an HOA rule? Or it's actually zoning from a city?
It's city zoning. I mean, I think I take a different view of HOA, where people or community associations, things like that. People who move into a community acknowledge that the rules are such. But if it's the city simply imposing, I think in the case of Tulsa, if I recall, the city said that it was not suitable live plant material, as if they had some sort of enumerated list of what was suitable and what wasn't. Some places say you can't have anything growing that's taller than a foot, but it all comes down to aesthetics.
What's the difference between fruits and vegetables then? Why someone allow one or the other?
Absolutely bizarre. The Institute for Justice in the Miami Shores, Florida case listed a bunch of things that would have been fine. Lawn gnomes, fine. Tomatoes, iffy because they're a fruit, but some people consider them a vegetable. Avocados would be fine, and other, mangoes, other fruits. It really is just a completely arbitrary rule, and because of what's known as rational basis review, which basically says that in most cases, decisions of government are subject to a very, very low level of scrutiny. These rules are presumptively constitutional, and you the gardener, or in other cases, the person with the chickens in the backyard, you have to prove, why this is constitutional, and it's such a high bar that very few of these cases are successful.
Folks on the right would be very friendly to the idea that there's too much regulation involved in something like this. But in your work with folks who are to the left of the spectrum, what's their reaction to finding out that all of this is regulated?
That's a great question. I do think that food, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of a uniting issue where people on the left and the right both understand that overly pervasive food regulations aren't benefiting anyone. People on the left who want, folks to eat healthier. People on the right who are, very much value the property rights and other sort of inalienable rights we have, tend to agree on the issue of food. And so I've spoken with plenty of people who think these regulations are just downright bizarre, and who think that rules that get in the way of people growing healthy food are uniformly terrible.
The concept of sustainability, or at least the language of sustainability, works its way into corporate agriculture a lot. So your definition of sustainability, how is that treated by corporate? Are they amenable to your definition of sustainability?
I think so. I note in the book that sustainability isn't about how big or small you are. You can have a very small